da renderlo il più possibile proficuo.
Grazie Paolo. Sono in un terreno abbastanza ostico per quel che mi riguarda personalmente, nel senso che il terreno del diritto e della giurisprudenza è abbastanza lontano dal punto di vista delle competenze personali, ma è un terreno che davvero ho a poco scoperto all'interno della rete europea Feanza, dove invece il tema non solo del diritto alla casa, ma del diritto come occasione per aprire porte non in termini conflittuali distruttivi, ma in termini conflittuali sani, quelli che sanno porre sul tavolo un problema perché le diverse competenze si aggreghino per cercare di superare il problema. Ecco allora che una giornata come quella di oggi, e sarò decisamente breve per quel che vi ho detto anche solo qualche secondo fa, è una giornata che per me rappresenta un elemento di grande apertura e di grande possibilità di comprendere insieme a voi come nel rapporto con le istituzioni, nel rapporto con la legge ci sia molto da fare oggi, e che per questa cosa sia necessaria una stretta sinergia fra le parti. C'è molto da fare oggi perché non a caso il titolo del nostro incontro di oggi tratteggia il tema della criminalizzazione della povertà. Siamo dentro delle dinamiche che sembrano un po' mimetiche, quelle che cercano un po' di trovare insieme un capro espiatorio per cercare di ridarsi un'identità, e sembra che le persone senza dimora siano un po' gli homeless, sia un possibile capro espiatorio, una possibile vittima rispetto a delle dinamiche di frammentazione, a delle dinamiche di crisi identitaria che i nostri territori, le nostre comunità, le nostre aree metropolitane, ma anche i luoghi più piccoli, più circoscritti stanno vivendo. Si tratta chiaramente di un grossissimo, di un tragico errore, quello di provare a pensare che i più esclusi, i più poveri siano i responsabili del difficile momento che stiamo vivendo. Però questo spesso succede perché lo dicono le istituzioni, succede anche perché c'è una cultura diffusa che legittima questo genere di dinamiche, che legittima il fatto che davvero ci sia la necessità di individuare un diverso come responsabile del proprio malessere. Allora, è quindi necessario mettere una sorta di cornice e di freno. Attenzione, stiamo andando oltre quello che è lecito e quello che è legittimo, non solo in termini culturali ma in termini di legge. Allora ecco che un convegno come quello di oggi, con la presenza di così tanti esperti, lo dico a pro mio ma a pro vostro, noi siamo qua con di fatto i maggiori esperti in Europa sul tema del diritto alla casa. Questo è un gruppo di lavoro che da tempo promuove a livello europeo una serie di litigation, di cause che hanno lo scopo, anche perché sono concordate con gli stessi Stati membri dell'Unione Europea, di attivare una serie di processi a favore delle persone senza dimora. Sono quindi persone che per la maggior parte conosco personalmente da tempo, che davvero hanno un patrimonio di competenze ma anche di capacità di trasmettere il senso di un'azione che promuova legalità e riconoscimento anche per chi fa più fatica come le persone senza dimora, ma anche per i servizi che operano per le persone senza dimora, perché c'è una grandissima analogia fra la legittimità dell'esistere come persona in povertà e la legittimità di un servizio che aiuti e che abbia risorse per le persone in povertà. Ecco allora che concludendo ringrazio anche Paolo Pezzani, ringrazio tutti coloro che ci danno il loro tempo e voi che siete qua manifestando una grossa attenzione, come è stato per l'assessore, come per l'assessore che ringrazio davvero perché conosciamo da tempo sia l'impegno del Comune di Genova sia l'impegno dei servizi delle organizzazioni che su Genova lavorano, e nel ringraziarvi lascio la parola di nuovo a Paolo Pezzana.
Grazie Stefano. E nell'introdurci, avendo recuperato un pochino del tempo a nostra disposizione, nell'ordine dei lavori di oggi, prima ancora che fare io una piccola introduzione, che sarà comunque molto breve, volevo davvero sottolineare con voi un elemento di quello che Stefano ha detto, e cioè il grande valore che abbiamo a disposizione oggi intorno a questo tavolo. L'organizzazione di questo seminario è stata possibile perché l'Osservatorio Europeo sul diritto all'alloggio, l'Housing Rights Watch, di cui ho l'onore di far parte come rappresentante dell'Italia, aveva deciso già da tempo di riunirsi questa volta in Italia, e visto che alcuni di loro sono amici e hanno apprezzato in passato le visite alla nostra città, abbiamo scelto Genova e quindi ci vedevamo qui. Hanno accettato di buon grado la proposta che come federazione le abbiamo fatto di dedicare una parte dell'incontro di questi giorni a quello che stiamo facendo adesso, che banalmente significa che invece che lavorare sabato fino alle 13 e poi fare mezza giornata di turismo, sabato lavoreremo fino alle 18 e la riunione dell'osservatorio, e questa la mattina la dedichiamo a questo. Di questo li ringrazio perché non solo l'hanno fatto per amicizia, ma anche perché credono fermamente nel senso che queste istituzioni di tipo europeo hanno più profondo, che è proprio quello di connettere e animare le esperienze sui territori. Dovevamo avere con noi per un saluto di tipo istituzionale e per un intervento di tipo istituzionale il dottor Palomba, il prefetto di Rimini, che per una serie di ragioni che sarebbe troppo lungo spiegare adesso non credo riuscirà a raggiungerci, quindi era previsto in arrivo, non riusciamo a contattarlo, ma ci ha detto di avere un problema per cui probabilmente doveva ritornare indietro e quindi è possibile che non ci sia. Spendo però una parola sul suo coinvolgimento perché è stato molto interessante, in quanto è la prima volta che un prefetto, quindi un rappresentante del governo centrale a livello locale, sebbene non a Genova ma a Rimini, città nella quale si stanno portando avanti alcuni progetti, aveva ritenuto importante essere presente in prima persona come attore nel costruire reti di questo tipo, perché lui stesso aveva detto: noi abbiamo bisogno di attivare nei nostri territori alleanze il più larghe possibile, e quindi anche il ruolo della prefettura, che è quello comunque di tenere insieme, di convocare, di creare tavoli, di fare in modo che ci siano sul territorio le condizioni per gestire i problemi relativi all'ordine pubblico, alla sicurezza, alla vivibilità delle nostre città, può e deve avere un ruolo in questo tipo di contesti. Purtroppo appunto il fatto ci sta impedendo di averlo qui, ma crediamo che possa essere importante ragionare anche sull'opportunità in futuro di tenere coinvolte questo tipo di figure proprio in funzione dei temi di cui stiamo parlando e del loro impatto sulla vita sociale dentro le nostre attività. Avremo poi con noi, faranno degli interventi, Samara Jones, che è una delle migliori policy officer di FEANZA della Federazione Europea di cui parlavo prima, e che coordina questo osservatorio e questo gruppo di lavoro. Avremo Guillem Fernandez, evangelista da Barcellona, che oltre ad essere anche lui un profondo conoscitore del tema, è una persona che spende davvero ogni energia possibile nel movimento e quindi nel cercare di creare, connettere, animare e mettere insieme tutti coloro che possono dare una mano per contribuire a migliorare la condizione di chi soffre il problema del disagio abitativo. È molto attento al tema anche della rappresentazione culturale dell'homelessness e della povertà, e ha curato il recente rapporto europeo sulla criminalizzazione dell'homelessness, del quale gli ho chiesto di darci una veloce presentazione questa mattina perché è molto interessante. Entreremo poi, dedicando la parte maggiore di questa prima parte di esposizione, nel tema più strettamente giuridico, e qui davvero abbiamo personaggi di assoluto rilievo, perché Padre Kenna, docente all'Università di Galway e autore di 2 testi che a livello europeo sono considerati un po' la Bibbia del diritto all'alloggio, quindi chiunque studia questi temi in Europa fa riferimento a cose che Padre ha scritto o contribuito a scrivere, e quindi diciamo è uno dei fari dal punto di vista giuridico in questo momento su questo tema, che ci farà una panoramica sullo stato dell'arte, del diritto e della giurisprudenza intorno al tema dell'alloggio e dell'esigibilità del diritto all'alloggio in Europa e nei Paesi membri, e Jamie Barton, un avvocato giovane ma con molta esperienza, che a Londra e in generale nel Regno Unito ha ottenuto grossi e significativi successi con le sue azioni e con le azioni dei suoi colleghi in questo ambito, contribuendo a dare rilievo anche politico al tema che stava trattando e collegandosi con una rete di altri professionisti che stanno dando davvero un grosso contributo. Purtroppo non è con noi Adrian Berry, perché non riusciva a partire ieri. Oggi, tra problemi di scioperi e collegamenti Genova-Londra, che come sapete non sono, ci sono, è già qualcosa, ma non sono così frequenti, non riusciva a combinare il viaggio in maniera tale da essere in tempo con noi. Terminerà l'esposizione di questa prima parte il mio fraterno amico e caro consulente Marc Uri, che viene da Lione, conosce bene l'Italia e i nostri movimenti, e che in Francia è riuscito negli ultimi anni a organizzare gruppi di legali in tutto il paese in maniera molto molto efficace ed efficiente per promuovere massivamente azioni legali a tutela del diritto all'alloggio. La loro legislazione lo consente un po' più della nostra, ma comunque in maniera organizzata, facendo quindi sì che quelle che erano logicamente azioni di tutela degli individui, di singoli, delle posizioni di singoli individui, diventassero anche però azioni collettive e manifestazioni per dimostrare l'importanza di promuovere questo tipo di diritti. Ecco, io volevo partire proprio di qua, perché il titolo, diciamo, del mini intervento che mi era stato assegnato, quindi il diritto all'alloggio e la criminalizzazione dell'homelessness nella prassi politica e giurisprudenziale italiana, in realtà si riassume bene con lo slogan che avrei voluto scrivere in inglese, citando la ben nota canzone, ma che è stato tradotto in italiano, The Sound of Silence, il suono del silenzio, nel senso che purtroppo nel nostro paese, per varie ragioni, e ne elencherò brevemente tre, non c'è ancora una cultura ed un approccio strutturato alla tutela dei diritti delle persone più fragili e marginali attraverso gli strumenti del diritto. Siamo ancora e sempre portati a ragionare in termini di residualità, di competenza delle associazioni, dei volontari, delle persone di buona volontà, della solidarietà spontanea che nasce fra le persone, che sono tutti elementi assolutamente necessari per contrastare la grave emarginazione. Lungi da me lo squalificarne anche solo uno di quelli che ho citato, ma perdiamo di vista molto facilmente la dimensione del diritto ed il fatto che esistono degli strumenti anche legislativi che possono essere utilizzati e che dovrebbero essere utilizzati per promuovere la situazione di queste persone. I dati sulla homelessness ci dicono che la situazione in Italia è in crescita, anche se non sta esplodendo la parte più grave del fenomeno, sta esplodendo la fascia grigia, la parte che c'è immediatamente prima. Non è un caso se nei servizi della FIOPS in questo momento gli accessi sono in crescita pressoché ovunque, ma sono in crescita esponenziale. Mi viene in mente un po' quello che diceva l'assessore prima rispetto ai mutui, agli sfratti perché non si pagano i mutui. Sono in crescita esponenziale soprattutto in quei servizi che offrono beni e generi di prima necessità, le mense, i servizi di distribuzione di erogazione vestiario, i materiali di igiene, eccetera. Cioè ci sono sempre più persone insospettabili che si rivolgono a questo tipo di servizi, che magari una casa ce l'hanno, ma che non hanno le condizioni di reddito, le possibilità per mantenersi le condizioni essenziali per poter vivere dignitosamente. Quindi utilizzano questi tipi di servizi come succedanei per la mancanza di uno strumento di sostegno al reddito. In Italia non c'è un reddito minimo, la recente legge di stabilità, dopo averci promesso più volte che avrebbe preso in considerazione una misura di reddito minimo, ci ha messo 200 milioni sulla social card e detto ciao, arrivederci e grazie, per cui di nuovo ha disatteso questo tipo di aspettativa che avevamo, e non avendo strumenti di sostegno le persone improvvisano improvvisano. Procurarsi un pasto, un vestito, qualcosa di questo genere, laddove vengono distribuiti gratuitamente, è un modo indiretto per integrare il reddito. Queste fasce stanno esplodendo e purtroppo sappiamo che il percorso che porta verso l'emarginazione, il percorso di disaffiliazione, è una lenta ma progressiva discesa lungo un piano inclinato. C'è il rischio che davvero il peggio nei nostri mondi debba ancora venire, perché molte di queste persone potranno arrivare a perdere l'alloggio e quindi a ritrovarsi in una situazione di disagio abitativo nei prossimi anni, quando magari si dirà che le condizioni economiche generali stanno migliorando, ma invece per la fascia più bassa della popolazione saremo nel clou del disagio. E queste cose si possono notare facilmente. Avrei voluto cominciare l'incontro di oggi con un breve clip che però non mi è arrivato, che dimostra come lì, proprio lì, fuori da quelle finestre al piano terra, ogni sera si crea una cittadella nella quale una quindicina di persone in aumento in un'ora circa erigono con cartoni, assi di legno, coperte la loro casa. Ci si preparano e ci consumano i pasti che gli vengono portati, si sistemano, si fanno il letto, dormono e poi la mattina verso le 5:30, 6 la smantellano, lasciando logicamente dei residui che magari quando noi passiamo per venire a Palazzo di Giustizia ci danno anche giustamente un po' fastidio e dicono: guarda che degrado in questa città. È vero, è una situazione degradante, ma lo è soprattutto per coloro che abitano quella cittadella ogni sera. Ecco, parlare a loro e con loro di acronimi come CEDU, TUE, Corte di Giustizia dell'Unione Europea, articolo 34, titolo 10 del trattato, che sono un po' gli elementi che sentiremo a breve dai colleghi ampiamente citati, può sembrare una cosa senza senso. Questi si costruiscono la loro casa nei portici di Piccapietra, di sapere che c'è un articolo 34 che li può tutelare o un titolo 10 che si può utilizzare per stimolarne la protezione sociale, se ne fanno poco. Ma l'essere qui da più mondi e da più parti serve proprio per ribadire l'esigenza di costruire invece delle catene che tengano insieme tutte queste parti, perché anche loro possano partecipare direttamente al fatto e alle possibilità che questi strumenti offrono, e perché chi usa questi strumenti a partire dai legali non dimentichi mai, ma considero soprattutto anche gli operatori sociali, non dimentichi mai che tra il diritto e la prossimità esiste tutta quella gamma di azioni che chiamiamo relazione, che fanno parte del modo in cui noi stessi ci giochiamo ed entriamo dentro queste dinamiche, e solo attraverso la relazione si può pensare di incidere effettivamente in questo ambito. In Italia c'è stata recentemente una sentenza importante della Corte di Giustizia Europea riguardo questi temi, il cosiddetto caso Cambrai, che verrà penso citato dagli amici e dai colleghi tra breve, e che ha visto una condanna dell'Istituto Autonomo Case Popolari della provincia di Bolzano. Quindi stiamo parlando del paradiso del welfare per quanto riguarda l'Italia, non se la sono presa con Catanzaro, se la sono presa con Bolzano, e c'è stata peraltro una parziale condanna per discriminazione, per una serie di altri elementi. Questa sentenza traccia, come verrà probabilmente detto dopo, degli utili criteri interpretativi per utilizzare questi strumenti. È stata pronunciata nel nostro Paese, però nel nostro Paese non solo non se ne è parlato, ma quasi nessuno lo sa. Varie pronunce sono state fatte in questi anni dagli organismi europei in termini di condanna di pratiche discriminatorie o di mancata tutela verso cittadini italiani contro il nostro Paese, ma non se n'è mai parlato. Ai telegiornali sentiamo parlare di sanzioni dell'Europa in termini molto generici, vengono usati come argomenti per dirci che dobbiamo aumentare l'IVA, tagliare i costi, eccetera, eccetera. Sappiamo bene come funziona, ma in che cosa consistono queste sanzioni, su che cosa si basano, che cosa c'è dietro, che cosa possiamo fare noi tutti, non soltanto chi governa, per non essere sanzionati, non viene mai messo in discussione. Cade in qualche modo scende un po' in qualche modo il silenzio, così come scende troppo spesso su quel fenomeno che ha avuto una certa enfasi tra il 2007 e il 2008, 2008, il 2010, che è quello delle ordinanze comunali contro l'accattonaggio, contro il barbonismo. C'è stata una stagione, se la ricordate, nella quale molti sindaci, prevalentemente di centrosinistra, è bene ricordarlo, emettevano ordinanze per la tutela delle loro città che di fatto finivano a considerare le persone che si trovavano per la strada come un corpo estraneo, come diceva Stefano Galliani, ed una potenziale minaccia per la sicurezza. C'era stata una prima ondata di queste ordinanze promossa dalla Lega Nord, poi si è verificato questo fenomeno molto strano, per cui in alcune città appunto governate da chi teoricamente si proponeva come soggetto progressista sono esplose in maniera molto significativa. Queste ordinanze hanno rappresentato, fino all'intervento della Corte Costituzionale del 2011, che sostanzialmente ha detto ai sindaci solo in casi eccezionali e urgenti, pensateci bene, che ha un po' rallentato l'uso dello strumento, però hanno rappresentato un'ondata di potente criminalizzazione nei confronti di questa categoria di persone, dove criminalizzazione non vuol dire incarceramento o utilizzo diretto degli strumenti del diritto penale, ma come ci spiegherà Guglielmo anche in senso europeo, vuol dire un intervento lesivo dei diritti della persona fatto attraverso strumenti che possono anche essere amministrativi, ma che di fatto pongono la persona in una condizione nella quale non può esercitare i suoi diritti fondamentali e quindi sostanzialmente viene privata di una parte della sua libertà. Anche su questo è calato abbastanza facilmente il silenzio, lo si è derubricato ad un problema locale. Bene, non si tratta di problemi e di questioni locali, perché c'è una pentola che bolle sempre di più, chi lavora nei servizi se ne accorge, ma troppo spesso è occupato, è impegnato, è completamente preso dal far sì che la pentola non tracimi e possibilmente dal cercare di non ustionarsi mentre maneggia questa pentola. Invece dovremmo cercare di far sì che questo bollore si trasformi in qualcosa di più evoluto, rimanendo nella greve metafora, dovremmo cercare di cuocerci qualche cosa dentro e di produrre qualcosa di buono che possa essere sviluppato e donato a tutti. Quindi io spero che oggi possa rappresentare un nuovo passo, un primo passo. Ci piacerebbe replicare anche in altre realtà, con l'aiuto di avvocati di strada, dell'AIGA di altre province, dell'ordine degli avvocati di altre città, a sviluppare questo ragionamento e a provare a creare una rete che ci aiuti in qualche modo a far sì che ci sia un apporto attivo del diritto nei processi di inclusione sociale e che i mondi sociali si alleino da questo punto di vista col mondo del diritto per arrivare all'Europa che vogliamo sostanzialmente, perché si parte dal piccolo e noi come associazione usiamo partire dal più piccolo, dal più distante, dal più disagiato, perché riteniamo che quello sia l'indicatore, il luogo dove le contraddizioni si manifestano, per costruire qualcosa di più grande che vada a beneficio di tutti. Quel qualcosa di più grande per noi è l'Europa, è il modello sociale europeo di cui molti parlano ma che nessuno riesce a definire compiutamente, ma che per noi è essenzialmente il modello di una città e di un insieme di città dove tutti, davvero tutti, hanno la possibilità di costruire i propri percorsi di benessere, perché c'è uno Stato di diritto che gli garantisce le condizioni esterne per sviluppare dei propri desideri e perché c'è una rete di relazioni, di legami e di servizi che accompagna ciascuno nel mettere ciò che di proprio ha, nell'esercitare la propria responsabilità in questo tipo di compito, che non è mai un compito individuale ma è sempre un compito collettivo. E quindi, non avendo con noi il dottor Palomba, che avrebbe potuto dirci anche dal punto di vista appunto del governo centrale, del Ministero degli Interni, come questi temi vengono seguiti, passerei direttamente la parola a Samara Jones, per un quadro di ciò che sta accadendo in Europa attraverso Feanza e non solo a questo riguardo. Grazie.
Good morning. Thank you very much again for coming. Thank you on behalf of FEANZA and Housing Rights Watch. It's really very encouraging to see so many people here today. Since I'm doing this presentation in cooperation with Guillaume, I think I will turn over to him first to speak, and then I will close that first session. So.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting us to this conference. Our report on criminalization and housing rights and on criminalization of homelessness born of the indignation of various NGOs like FEANSA on Housing Rights Watch. Indignation because while homeless people are on the street, they are fined, punished, detained, or expelled from one area to another, from one city to another, or from another country to another. Homelessness is the main expression of the systematic violation of human rights in our societies. Homelessness is a consequence of violation of human rights, but it's also a cause of further violations. Traditionally, in the sociological discussion in 80s, the most common explanations for homelessness can be divided in two broad categories: individualistic reasons and structural explanations. The individualistic reasons, like mental health problems, addictions problems, alcoholic problems, or typical argument that they are bohemian people. Structural explanations are associated with employment markets or housing systems. But in 90s, at the beginning of the 21st century, under social exclusion paradigm, homelessness can be understood like a dynamic process, not defining a group of people or a static condition. It can be described as a continuum of situations of exclusion from inadequate housing. These situations are classified in the European typology of homelessness and housing exclusion like housing situations: rooflessness, homelessness, living in insecure accommodation, and living in inadequate housing. And from social exclusion paradigm, the causes of homelessness are structurals, but also institutionals, is when public services are not adapted to the needs of homeless people. And relational too, networks break down, family, friends, and individuals. Reasons too. But now this definition of homelessness is accepted by all European institutions: the European Parliament, the European Commission, the Committee of Regions, the Council of Europe. But the point is that penal policies and criminal law have made the opposite way. The idea based on crime prevention and rehabilitation of the offenders fell in the 80s by the influence of neoliberal thinking. The correctional model was progressively abandoned. Now, the criminal is a rational moral person who chooses crime after a preliminary analysis in which the expected benefit is perceived to be greater than the cost of the crime. The causes of crime disappear. The only one responsible is now the individual. In 90s, with the race society concept, criminality is viewed and managed as a non-eradicable risk. No one thinks in terms of culpability, but the risk of committing a crime. The construction and management of risk categories are in step with social inequalities and certain moral pronouncements regarding dangerous population. The poor are viewed as the new dangerous class that generates risk. Social problems appear as a criminal matters, and administrative law is viewed as a more efficient and effective means of handling at-risk population than criminal law. The perception of risk is not neutral or objective. There is a crucial role for the media to play to assist in the social and cultural construction of the perception of risk by establishing an atmosphere of fear. And politicians know this. They use the administrative law to send message of security and control. Maybe the rule is perhaps totally inadequate to achieve a reasonable level of application. But it doesn't matter, because the goal is the message of order sent to a society. You called this strategy the symbolic criminal law. Symbolic criminal law not only identifies a certain that did, but also a specific type of perpetrator of deed, who is defined as another, the enemy. The politicians use an aggressive language to create a certain image of social identity. Then begging becomes aggressive begging, and people who rummage through garbage bins looking for food or scavenging material are part of organized mafias. Maybe in some countries, but not in all. This is a criminalization of poverty. The typical argument from politicians is the rule is not a zero tolerance against the person committing the crime, but rather zero tolerance of the action itself. This is the typical argument. We are criminalizing actions, not people. But not interest is shown in the causes of crime or in the conditions in which it's committed, thus restoring criminal responsibility for his own act. The evidence from the sociological studies, Antonio Teosi's a reference on this, said that in Europe, homeless are not the explicit target of rules and orders regulating public spaces, but they do suffer the effects disproportionately as a result of their dependence on public spaces to carry out their daily activities. In many European countries, the most prominent target group of public fear and hence of control measures are migrants and Roma. But the last report of European Observatory on Homelessness said that on levels migrant homelessness in Europe showed that a growing number of migrant homeless, particularly people living roads and using emergency shelters. Evidence of refugees and asylum seekers and undocumented migrants, homeless people, and ethnic and cultural minorities who appear to be at a disproportionate risk of homelessness. In this context, it's easy to associate poor people, migrants, or Roma people like the others. When these individuals represent a danger, when they are a source of risk for the established social order, they should be subjected to the dictates of the criminal law of the enemy. The criminal law of the enemy has three characteristics. Criminalization on the previous state before they commit crimes. There is a disproportional sanctions, and there is a minimization of procedural guarantees. And this is the typical case of people who are in detention centers in all of Europe. The concept of enemy is undetermined and can be extended to the other spheres, like social services, health services, or shelter system, creating criteria or obstacles for access to public services. Bachmann explains the duality of policies targeting the poor, saying that social policy and criminal policy are two sides of the same political coin, managing poverty. For this reason, in the report, we have used the concept of penalization from Bachmann and a special rapporteur on poverty from United Nations, Magdalena Sepúlveda. The penalization measures are policies and administrative regulations used to punish, segregate, and control people living in poverty. And we can do this in two different ways. Direct penalizations, for example, is the criminalization that homeless people suffer in the streets through laws against vagrancy and begging that regulation behavior on public space. And indirect penalization is, for example, the administrative difficulties accessing on shelter for certain homeless people. We have two clear examples in Europe. For the direct penalization, maybe the worst case is the Hungarian case. The Hungarian case, the government has changed the Article 8 of the Constitution and now is doing a federal law that has been passed that allows municipalities to create clean zones, zones without homeless people, for tourists or for activities or commercial. In Netherlands, homelessness migrants can be barred from accessing emergency shelters. National laws have effectively excluded irregular migrants from any government assistance, but since 2010, the situation worsened when local authorities were instructed by the national government to no longer provide emergency shelter to irregular migrants, included families with children. In July 2012, FEANSA filed a collective complaint against Netherlands, claiming that legislation, policy and practice regarding sheltering homeless people and is not compatible with the revised social charter that probably Parik and the other speakers will explain better than me. And the point is how we can work with people that they don't know their rights, how we can work with people that they don't know how to exercise their rights. They cannot exercise their rights too, because sometimes they have health problems or alcoholics. And a lot of time, they don't believe in a justice. They don't believe in a systems that exclude them. For this reason, our proposal to be here is we need to create networks. We need to create networks between different sectors. The homeless sector, who has social workers to take direct contact with homeless people, with public workers from social services too, because together they can identify gaps in the public policy. And sometimes the local level knows better the needs of homeless people than the national level. And sometimes the municipalities have more arguments and more reasons to achieve this change of legislation. But other networks can be between human rights NGOs and academics, translating these gaps in human rights concepts. And other alliances can be too, if we need political pressure, if we need to do political pressure, we can contact with social movements and to make relations with the ombudsman. And social movements are very important to creating networks with people affected by this problematic, empowering themselves. I think that these are the arguments, and the rest of the speakers probably they will develop these kind of ideas, and Samara will complete this. Thank you, Samara.
Okay. Hello again. Yes, we'd like to point out that the book, the report, this is the first time anybody has seen the book. It was delivered to our offices on Wednesday. So the report is available. You can buy a book, or you can also download the book. It will be available on our Housing Rights Watch website, which is also being launched today, and over the next few weeks we'll be making the site active and accessible with documents, with films, with campaign tools, with instruments that we're going to talk about today for lawyers, for social workers, for social workers. And the website, I just make a bit of publicity, it will be www.housingrightswatch.org. And we will have available outside for everyone to take if you want. It's an executive summary of the book. And the executive summary talks about the definitions, which I think are really very important for lawyers, for social workers, to understand, as Guillaume has said, why it's so important to think about criminalization, because in fact it's undermining real solutions to dealing with poverty problems, to dealing with homelessness, and it's causing the solutions that we're trying to put in place, it's making them less effective and is in fact causing more problems. So I think the executive summary itself is a good introduction, obviously. And I think, as Guillaume pointed out, that this issue is something that can be a very useful way to start working together in networks. So if we think about the Hungarian example that Guillaume pointed out, in some ways it's both the worst example and the best example, because in trying to fight against the Hungarian government's criminalization of homeless people, of making it illegal to sleep rough for more than twice in 6 weeks period. You could be then fined up to several hundred euros for more than one instance of being found sleeping in a public place, and you could be put in prison. So when this law came in 2012, even before that, an alliance, a really interesting alliance of an activist group of homeless and formerly homeless people, supported by what they call allies. So people who are not speaking for the homeless people, but speaking with them and helping them to articulate their concerns and their arguments, and providing peer-to-peer education and so on. So this group, called The City is for All, worked together with homeless people and with some interesting and perhaps non-traditional allies. They worked with the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, so lawyers, to develop strategic litigation against the national law and the local measures that were in place to criminalize homelessness. And they worked with social workers, with the service providers in Budapest and in other cities, to form a strong network to challenge these laws. And they did this in the courts, but even before the courts, they did this in some very peaceful civil disobedience. So there were some sit-ins in the local authorities, I guess the mayor of Budapest, of one district. They had a sit-in in his office to draw attention to the problem, to show how serious an impact it was having. And they worked together to develop the arguments and to provide the data to go into strategic litigation, because of course you can't go to court with nothing in your hands. And so they could take the arguments of the government, which said, well, we don't want people sleeping on the streets. And of course, nobody wants people sleeping on the streets. And so this was the government's way to make sure that nobody was sleeping on the streets. And they said, of course, everyone can go to a shelter. Well, if you have only 3,000 shelter beds in all of Budapest, and you have more than 8,000 homeless people by the government's own recognition as the statistics, then you have an absolute imbalance of supply of accommodation, and shelter, of course, is not the right kind of accommodation. So even if you just talk about shelters, there's not enough. And you have a far greater demand. You have a far bigger number of people who need support and need somewhere to sleep. So if you make it illegal for that extra 5,000 people to sleep anywhere, or to find solutions that they, out of necessity, then you're just making the problem even worse. And so the activists worked together with the lawyers to create the arguments to challenge the law, and it was successful. They won. It was overturned. It went to the Constitutional Court. It was upheld. And then their very, very strong prime minister, who has an absolute majority in the government, decided to change the constitution. And he was changing the constitution on a number of other issues to reduce freedoms and rights across the board for other groups as well, but particularly for homeless people. one could say, the most vulnerable group of people anyways. Now their rights are even more restricted and in fact just frankly violated by the new constitution. So the Hungarians are in a bit of a difficult situation because how do you challenge it now? So now the new law is in place, and once there are cases of people who have been charged under this law, there will be a whole new process. But now the Constitutional Court was also reformed to make it have less power, and because this law is now in the Constitution, you can't take it before their own Constitutional Court. So it's both a very bad example of how far a government can go to to criminalize homelessness, but it's also a very good example of how these networks can work together to share information and to really develop a dynamic that is a very positive aspect. Because, for example, the public opinion in Budapest is very much on the side of homeless people, which is not usually the case. That's not usually the case, that public opinion is in favor of the rights of homeless people, or is even aware of the needs or the concerns of homeless people. So it's both been a very positive thing in terms of network building, but a very frightening example of how far this criminalization can go. In addition to that, I just would conclude to say that while Hungary is perhaps the worst and biggest example on a national scale, criminalization and penalization of homelessness occurs across the EU and in every country and in most cities. We commissioned some pro bono lawyer reporting last year that looked at antisocial behavior laws in about 20 EU countries. And it turns out that in most of these countries, your country, for example, the ability to criminalize and penalize homelessness and poverty is written down. It's on the books. And it's just whether a municipality or a police force decides to enforce it or not. So the fact that it's always there is in fact a threat. It can be used, as a coercive tool by municipalities, by police in certain situations, and in some cities it's used more than in others. But it does exist everywhere. And in times of crisis, where more and more people are in desperate situations, it seems that municipalities obviously have less and less resources to help deal with the situation, but in fact are turning to more and more repressive and restrictive measures. And so something needs to happen to reverse this trend. And so that's why we're trying to draw attention to the issue at European level to help bring allies together at local level. So social workers who are working with people to help deal with their situations and help to deal with perhaps the number of fines they've received, or the numbers of tickets, or the fact they've been excluded from certain parts of the city, and helping them to find ways to challenge that, with support from lawyers, with support from legal academics and so on, to work together to reverse this trend. And so at the European level, we organized a seminar, a hearing in the European Parliament last month, and Guillaume came to present the findings of the report. We had allies from Hungary speaking as well, and we were hosted by a member of the European Parliament from Lyon, from Marc's region in France. And the European parliamentarians are also interested, because it's both a local, a national, and a European issue. So it's something that I think we all need to learn more about and find ways to work together to challenge it. And just to conclude, again, the information, the report is available now, and we'll be very happy to continue talking about it and continue finding examples of how we can work together to challenge it.
Grazie. Grazie a Samara Guilhem. Vi do subito un'informazione pratica che può essere utile. All'uscita sul tavolo potete trovare, mi passi, can I have this one? La sintesi del report in inglese, disponibile stampata per tutti. A breve, se le finanze di fianza... È in francese, chiedo scusa, non me ne ero accorto. Ok. A breve, se le finanze di Feanza ce lo permettono, sarà disponibile anche in italiano. Per questo l'invito è quello a lasciare la mail o a iscriversi anche direttamente, ci sono Michele e gli altri collaboratori disponibili, alla newsletter di FIOPS, attraverso la quale vi potremo poi recapitare tutti quanti i materiali e tutto quello che viene prodotto a questo riguardo. Passiamo adesso, prima di un break in cui potremo prenderci un caffè al bar che è qui al piano, quindi non bisogna neanche distanziarsi più di tanto, passiamo adesso alla parte invece appunto più strettamente legata all'applicazione delle norme europee, alla giurisprudenza che si è creata. Dopo l'intervento appunto di Padraig e di Jamie avremo il break, dopo il break uno spazio piuttosto lungo nel quale spero ci si possa confrontare anche tecnicamente e praticamente sul come fare. Loro sono venuti essenzialmente per questo, quindi ora tracceranno un quadro di riferimento e poi speriamo insieme di poterci confrontare molto praticamente sul come muoverci. Lascio quindi la parola con molto piacere a Padraig, che ha anche una presentazione e che credo andremo adesso a vedere. Go Padraig, the floor is to you. Bisogna far partire la presentazione, vediamo, dovrebbe, ok, 1, 2, 3, perfetto, fantastico.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to say thank you very much to Paolo and Stefano for inviting us here to this historic city. We're delighted to be here. I'm going to try and relate the European Union laws with homelessness. Now, it's only 20 minutes, so there's a lot more, but I will tell you how to find more at the end. The European Union is growing. As you know, we now have 28 states since the 1st of July, and every one of these states has particular national laws and policies. Sometimes national, sometimes at a lower level, city, region, even smaller. So how do we move from that situation to something like a European housing rights model? That's what I'm going to look at in this short presentation here. We also have the Council of Europe, which is 47 states, again with a whole variety of national laws and policies, procedures, etc., etc. But a lot of these have been examined by the European Court of Human Rights of the Council of Europe through, if you like, indirect or obscure ways. There is no express right to housing in the European Convention of Human Rights, but sometimes it's found through obscure and indirect routes. For instance, Article 3, where housing is part of inhuman or degrading treatment, or in terms of the right to respect for home, where the state has taken some action which breaches Article 8. Jamie is going to expand on some of these points after me. So we find in that European Convention of Human Rights, housing rights indirectly appear under Articles 2, 3, 6, 8, 15, 14, and occasionally, in fact, often now, Article 1 of Protocol 1, where an entitlement to housing, once it's approved, becomes treated as a possession. And that possession cannot be deprived by state action. Lots of cases there, very short summary. It's not my main point. The main point I want to focus on is the impact of EU law. And we are beginning to see, you can see EU law in the middle of this diagram, that there are growing areas of overlap between national laws and policies, sometimes local laws and policies, and EU law. It's that purple area there in the middle. Overlapping areas where two systems are interacting. Sometimes called shared competencies, different names. We see it particularly in terms of the rules on the coordination of social security across the European Union, with the directives the regulations from 2004 and 2009, where, for instance, national rules on entitlements are subject to Court of Justice of the European Union scrutiny on their necessity and proportionality, for instance. So it's becoming a little bit complex. But we also find a whole lot of areas around migration, citizenship, non-discrimination, refugees, and of course the controversial area of the carers of EU-born children, the non-EU parents of EU-born children. What all of these have done are highlighted issues around housing rights within the EU law system. Sometimes this is described as member states implementing EU law, which, as we know, is covered by treaty law. The action of a member state implementing EU law is covered by the law of the European Union. But we're also seeing terms like within the scope of EU law, which is included in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. And we're also seeing terms like governed by EU law in more recent cases. So what I want to say is this area is fluid. It's not fixed. It's moving. And as we know, those overlap areas are defined by EU law norms. In that area, we've had quite a lot of cases, and this is a summary, very short summary, of housing and homelessness cases which were treated under EU law. Commission versus Germany in the very early days around migration, free movement. Commission versus Italy on the same issue. Zambrano, you're all familiar with Zambrano, the non-EU parents of an EU-born child in Belgium, entitled to housing assistance. Two English cases, Harrow and Lambeth, Abraham and Teixeira, again, housing cases based on equal treatment, free movement, and EU law. And you've had a more recent one, Cambrai, which is an Italian case, where the Charter of Fundamental Rights was used to ensure that a housing benefit, which was denied to a long-term non-European residents, was restored in that case. There are lots of others. So the point is, the dynamics between EU law and national law has changed. It has changed even more fundamentally since the 1st of December 2009, with the coming into force of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, having the same legal force as treaty law. This is an enormous upgrading of what was previously solemnly proclaimed. The Charter applies to EU institutions, bodies and agencies, as well as member states, but only when implementing EU law, or as it says later, acting within the scope of EU law. So there is a nexus required, a link required with EU law for the Charter to become powerful. And this link, this nexus, that purple area that I mentioned, is quite broad. Competition law, state aid, citizenship, migration, race, gender, disability, consumer protection, areas where there is an EU international treaty, for instance, people with disabilities, asylum seekers. Also, long-term residents, covered by the Long-Term Residence Directive, public procurement and tendering of public bodies, which is very much controlled by EU regulations. The whole area of building rules and energy efficiency, fire regulations, unfair contract terms. Key areas of EU law which impact on housing and homelessness. And once these are engaged, then the Charter of Fundamental Rights becomes active. So what's in the Charter? Well, there's quite a lot, but I don't have time to go through each one. I'll summarize them later. But what's interesting is the status of the Charter. And the Charter is accompanied, as you know, by something known as explanations, which explain the Charter shall be given, well, Article 52, first of all, of the Charter says, the explanations shall be given due regard by the courts of the Union and of Member States. The explanations say, although they do not as such have the status of law, they're a valuable tool of interpretation to clarify the provisions of the Charter. And they refer to states acting within the scope of EU law. This term has actually been used now in lots of judgments. The Charter, of course, does not create standalone rights. The rights created within the Charter are only linked to positions where EU law is involved. What they do is enhance the human rights protection of EU law, as well as the actions of EU institutions and Member States when they are implementing EU law. The Charter, of course, has been instrumental in a number of cases linked to housing and homelessness in the broad sense, including ME and others, the asylum seekers cases, where the court pointed out the Member States must not only interpret their national law in a manner consistent with the European Union law, but make sure they do not rely on an interpretation of an instrument of secondary legislation which would be in conflict with the fundamental rights protected by the Union legal order or other general principles of EU law. And that was a case of a refugee who was an asylum seeker, who didn't wish to be returned, who the states wished to return to Greece, and where the court found conditions in detention centres for asylum seekers were below that which the Charter could support. The question of states implementing EU law, of course, that is really the crux, the central question. When are states acting in a way where there is no EU law involved? Now, this link, this field, it's quite fluid. It changes. It's not always very certain. We know that states, when dealing with transposed directives or legislation, are clearly acting within implementing EU law. Also, where they are derogating from EU law is clearly within the scope. A number of recent cases have mentioned concepts like governed by EU law, Act Larigan. The court settled law states, in essence, that the fundamental rights guaranteed in the legal order of the Union are applicable in all situations governed by European Union law. Now, that's broader than what we had before. So what they're saying here is where the state is acting in an area in which there is EU legislation, that is potentially an area governed by EU law. In this case, this was the Swedish case. It was a local tax, where the European Court of Justice said, well, the EU has issues around these local taxes. This is, I've been advised, spelt wrong. It should be ministerial and not ministerial, fiscal. Again, recent case, this is text. Article 53 confirms where an EU legal act calls for national implementation measures, national authorities and courts remain free to apply national standards, provided that the level of protection provided for by the Charter, as interpreted by the Court, and the primacy, unity and effectiveness of EU law are not compromised. I'm moving now to probably the most significant case of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Housing, Canberra, 2012. And in this case, the local authority withdrew housing benefit on the basis of budgetary constraints for some long-term non-European residents, including Canberra, who was from Albania. And the court said, in this case, Court of Justice of the European Union, when determining the social security, social assistance and social protection measures defined by their national law and subject to the principle of equal treatment enshrined in the Long-Term Residence Directive, the Member States must comply with the rights and observe the principles provided for under the Charter, including those laid down in Article 34. Under Article 34(3) of the Charter, in order to combat social exclusion and poverty, the Union and the Member States, when they are implementing Union law, recognise and respect the right to social and housing assistance so as to ensure a decent existence for all those who lack sufficient resources, in accordance with the rules laid down by European Union law and national laws and policy. And this is a very important article, because it recognises a right to housing and social assistance in order to combat social exclusion and poverty. But the next part is even more important for our conversation this morning, so as to ensure a decent existence for all those who lack sufficient resources. Now, this could mean that we will establish a minimum standard of assistance across the European Union so as to ensure a decent existence. A decent existence, of course, is something that is defined in many European documents, in many national documents across the EU states, particularly around the whole area of combating social exclusion. All of the documents that have been prepared over the last 10 years on that area. And this potentially offers the possibility of establishing a minimum harmonized standard for social and housing assistance across Europe. Going back to the main point then of my talk, which I just realized is involving the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, added value for the protection of housing. The Charter of Fundamental Rights, the EU CFR, actually brings into binding EU law a whole range of measures and articles of the European Convention of Human Rights, but also the European Social Charter. And the explanations point this out clearly. Article 2 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Charter, EU Charter, corresponds with Article 2 of the European Convention. Article 4 corresponds with Article 3. Article 7 corresponds with Article 8. That means they're worded identically. So any of the cases of the European Court of Human Rights on this issue that are related to housing are automatically the guidance for EU law interpretations. Again, Article 17 with Article 1 of Protocol 1, Article 19 with Article 3, Article 49 with Article 7. But significantly, it points out that Article 34(3), the right to social and housing assistance, which I just described, is linked and corresponds with Articles 30 and 31 of the revised European Social Charter, which is around the right to protection from poverty and social exclusion and the right to housing. So, to try and summarize it in a little graph, I hope it doesn't confuse you at all. We have national laws on the outside, the blue one. We have in the middle EU law. We have the overlapping areas in purple. And then we have this EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in that circle. We find key areas of overlap between national laws, EU law, and the Charter. Key areas are becoming identified now, where you see the yellow arrows pointing. And in these areas, because of the explanations, we know we can introduce all of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights on housing, but also we can introduce all the decisions of the European Committee of Social Rights of the Council of Europe in relation to Articles 30 and 31. And I hope that isn't too confusing. I want to just say finally, aside from all of these technical points, it's important to remember that the EU itself has created, as Mr. Fernandez has pointed out earlier, a new terminology for us to look at homelessness. And that is that it's based on the concept of combating social exclusion. Social exclusion, rather than personal failure or criminal intent, is the dominant EU model for dealing with homelessness. In fact, the preamble of the treaty, the recent treaty on the functioning of the EU, points out that the EU shall combat social exclusion and discrimination and promote social justice and protection. So this is part of the fundamental law of the European Union. I would suggest that it is time that we started to introduce those fundamental principles into our cases around homelessness, and that, of course, this is European law, which is applicable not just in Luxembourg, but in all the national courts around the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, grazie. E adesso chiederei a Jamie Barton se dal punto di vista di un attore del diritto che quotidianamente è impegnato nel far valere azioni su questo fronte completa la panoramica che Patrick ci ha fatto, dandoci ulteriori indicazioni pratiche su come si possono utilizzare questi strumenti.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Paolo. Paolo is right to say that I am a lawyer, but I would like you all to try really, really hard to imagine not that I'm a lawyer, but that I'm a human being. And as a human being, I have certain rights. We actually call them human rights. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about what it means to have human rights, in particular under the European Convention of Human Rights, in this context. Now this is a pen, and it's not any old pen, though. It's my pen. And one thing we can be very sure about in terms of human rights under the European Charter is that my human rights include my right to keep my pen. And nobody can take my pen off me unless they have a very good reason to do so. And that is fundamentally how our human rights are set up in Europe. It is really about whether or not there is any right to interfere with people's rights of property. But what I want to tell you about today is how that is slowly changing in Europe to produce a situation where if somebody else needs my pen more than me, it's possible I have to let them use my pen. Now, of course, this discussion is not about pens or anything else. It's about homes. But I want to try and elaborate a principle which is developing in the European Court, which I hope at least will become more dominant in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, so that we can try and reach a position where property rights are not always the obstacle to people having human rights. Now, the relevant convention, as Porek has said, under the European Convention are twofold. There are two rights that we're concerned with. The first is Article 3, which is the right not to be subjected to torture or inhuman or degrading treatment. And there is some emerging case law which suggests that where a state creates a set of circumstances or a system where somebody is rendered destitute, in those circumstances that will constitute inhuman or degrading treatment, and therefore a breach of Article 3, for which there can be no justification, because Article 3 is not a qualified right, it's an absolute right. But the circumstances in which Article 3 is likely to be violated are very, very extreme circumstances. First of all, the people concerned have to have no right to work. Not a capacity to work, no right to work. Second, they have to have no right to state assistance in the ordinary understanding of the term. So no right to municipal housing, no right to social benefits, etc. You can quickly see that the only group of people likely to fit this category are, of course, asylum seekers or migrants, who traditionally we do not allow to work, certainly not until their status has been clarified, but that can often take many years. And similarly, we don't give them the same kind of benefits that, for example, people who are unable to work, who are nationals of a member state, are normally entitled to. The consequence is that the European Convention on Human Rights in Article 3 will protect the rights of those people, but to a very, very minimal degree. They should be given the right of very basic subsistence, including shelter and maybe food vouchers or something of that nature. And that is not really what you and I talk about when we talk about our home or a right to a home. Because of course one's home has all sorts of other implications. It is not just a place where one can rest one's head, one can eat or sleep. It's also the social center of one's life. It is also the emotional center often of one's life. It is a place where one develops oneself and expresses oneself most obviously. So to only talk about home as minimal shelter is a categorical mistake. So I'm not going to talk about Article 3 anymore, but it is there and it must be understood as a basic threshold that may require somebody to borrow my pen for a very short period of time every week, but not to have their own pen. So where are we under Article 8 of the European Convention? Well, Article 8, of course, just says that we have a right to respect for our family, our private life, and our home. And the first thing you realize from those words is it's not a right to a home, it's just a right to respect to your home. It presupposes one has a home to be respected. It doesn't provide, in the wording at least, an opportunity for somebody to claim a home in circumstances where they do not have one. But slowly, under the jurisprudence of the European Court, we are getting some steps closer to a situation where somebody without a home, as we conventionally understand it, ought to be entitled to one provided to them. Not necessarily free, and not necessarily without conditions, but as a prerequisite to them having any form of social participation in society. And I'm only going to use one case to try and show this as an example of developing jurisprudence, and it's a case which comes from Bulgaria called Genova. And indeed, Porek mentioned it in his talk. He probably knows the case better than me, actually, but anyway, I'm just going to talk about it very briefly. Genova concerned about 300 Roma living near Sofia in Bulgaria on a piece of state land for which they had no permission to be there. In other words, they had no property rights. as we conventionally understand them to be there. But despite that, they'd been there for 30 or 40 years, lived there for generations. It had become, for all extents and purposes, their home. It was their emotional center, it was where they expressed themselves, it was where they conducted their family relations, etc. However, they didn't have sanitary conditions, they didn't have running sewage, they didn't have the types of amenities that you and I would ordinarily expect in our home. The consequence was that people who lived nearby them, who weren't Roma, became dissatisfied with this Roma community living so close to them. They put a lot of pressure on the Bulgarian authorities to move this community from this piece of land. That pressure, that political pressure, eventually resulted in a decision of the mayor to give these 300 people 7 days' notice to leave this land they'd lived on for 30 or 40 years. In circumstances where it was understood that certainly for the vast majority of them, they had no other land to go to. So the question was for the European Court, in brief terms, was this a violation of their right to respect for their home? Now, the first point to understand is that historically, not immediately before this case, but historically at least, the right to respect to one's home under Article 8 rarely extended beyond the ordinary property rights the person in that home already enjoyed. So where their property rights ended, so indeed did their right to respect for their home. But the European Court has now moved away from that position. And the concept of something being somebody's home is now an autonomous concept. It is not dependent on having any legal right to be in occupation of the piece of land or the building that one is otherwise living in as a home. A place where one sleeps, a place where one eats, a place where one socializes, a place where one does all the kind of activities one does in private. So the court recognized, first and foremost, that despite the absence of any property rights, it was still these Roma families' home. The significance of that should not be lost on you, because one rarely needs to rely on one's human rights to defend one's home if one already has conventional property rights to live in one's home. The conventional property rights normally do that job for you. If you pay rent and you have a tenancy, normally it offers you some protection from an arbitrary decision from your landlord to evict you. If you own your own home, then certainly you enjoy some protection against the state or other people, ordinarily at least, trying to take your home off you. So human rights are only likely to become necessary when you don't have those conventional property rights. And of course, the people who most commonly don't have those conventional property rights are, of course, the ones who can't afford them. So we immediately understand that the right to rely on our human rights to protect our home is only likely to arise in circumstances where we don't have property rights and we can't afford property rights. And that, of course, was precisely the situation of these 300 Roma family. But again, that isn't the end of the story, because a state is permitted to interfere with a right to respect for one's home if in doing so they are pursuing a legitimate aim and it is necessary to do so in a democratic society. And that is the test under Article 8 of the European Convention that the court must apply. So when the court were asked to consider whether or not it was lawful of the mayor of Sofia to ask for the Roma families to be evicted in 7 days, the court had to ask themselves the question whether or not it was in pursuit of a legitimate aim and whether or not it was necessary in a democratic society. Now, the Roma family said that it was not in pursuit of a legitimate aim, it was in the pursuit of racism. Because in fact, what had been said by the mayor, and I have to look at my quote now, was that Roma families could not expect to live among citizens as they did not have the necessary culture. That was considered by the Roma families to be the true reason why they were being asked to leave the land, because complaints were being made by non-Roma residents and neighbors who didn't like the way they lived on the land. They kept live animals, for example. They didn't have sewage facilities, but that was not really an aspect of their culture. It was an aspect of their poverty, etc. And so the Roma argued that there was a violation of their Article 8 right to respect for their home, because the interference with their home was not in pursuit of a legitimate aim, it was in pursuit of cultural racism. And the European Court rejected that argument and found that in fact it was not because of racism, but there was real evidence that the authorities wanted to develop the land to use it for better purposes. And once that was established, they had to accept it. But there was one very important point they made when reaching that conclusion, which was this: that it will not ordinarily be enough for a landlord, whether it's the state or otherwise, but most commonly it's going to be the state, to simply say, well, it's our land, we want it back. That will not be enough, and will always, it would seem, be likely to be trumped by the housing interests of the people who live there. So the state is obliged to come up with some other reason, something more than simply, this is our land and we own it and you have no right to be there. In this particular case, they were happy with the explanation they were given by the authorities, which was it was to develop the land for better purposes, to make better use of the land, and the court accepted that. However, and this is the part of the case which is really significant and is indicative of the way in which human rights are changing away from the conventional liberal model, which simply protects property rights. Because what the court said was essentially this: that in order to be sure that the eviction of these Roma families was necessary in a democratic society, it was, in other words, proportionate. It was necessary for the authorities to consider where these people were going to go if they were evicted, and what would their circumstances be if they were evicted. Because it's all very well developing this piece of land, but not if it means these people are going to find their situation worsening. So, in effect, what the court concluded was that the Bulgarian authorities were going to be prevented from evicting these 300 Roma until they could show very clearly that their situation would improve as a consequence. In other words, they would be offered alternative accommodation. Accommodation in respect of which they would have their own property rights, a lawful right to be there, accommodation with proper amenities attached to it, sewage facilities and such like, and the kind of accommodation which was going to make it less likely, not more likely, that they would come into conflict with their non-Roma neighbors. So in other words, this came close to the European Court saying that the Roma could have my pen. That these particular Roma ought to be given accommodation, even though there is no right to housing under the European law, by taking a very broad interpretation of what is somebody's home, which of course could include somebody on the street sleeping in a shelter. If you sleep there long enough, if you express yourself there, if you live your private life there, it's your home. And if the authorities want to come along and clear the path where your shelter is based, under the European law now, in Article 8, they might need to be able to prove to a court that there is somewhere else for you to go. Not only somewhere else, but somewhere else better than the shelter that you've constructed for yourself on the street or wherever. So the really important parts of this emerging jurisprudence is that our human rights will no longer be exclusively determined by our property rights. And we move one step closer to a situation where somebody who doesn't have a proper home has a right to ask the state to make provision to ensure that in the future they do. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Quello che Jamie ci ha ricordato adesso è forse uno dei punti cruciali di ciò che è importante discutere oggi, perché questa evoluzione del diritto deve essere e può essere accompagnata da un'evoluzione della cultura e da un'evoluzione delle prassi per diventare lentamente anche evoluzione politica. Stiamo parlando di mettere in discussione una delle basi fondamentali dei nostri ordinamenti e della nostra cultura da diverse centinaia di anni, quindi non è un... ma appaiono segni di questo tipo. Siamo andati leggermente oltre sull'orario, ma io vi proporrei, se resistete, proprio per completare, avere poi un po' più spazio per il coffee break e poi discutere nel concreto questi elementi, di ascoltare Marc, perché l'esperienza francese nuovamente in modo molto concreto ci può aiutare a fare davvero, ad avere un quadro di come si può azionare questo tipo di strumenti anche sul nostro territorio. Poi Jamie e Padai credo che nella seconda parte, interagendo, potranno raccontarci un po' di anche come in Irlanda e nel Regno Unito stanno utilizzando questo tipo di attività. Quindi Marc, a te la parola per raccontarci come funziona in Francia.
Grazie mille, mi dispiace non parlo italiano. So, I will improve. So the situation in France we had was people having difficulties and without being able to put legal terms on these difficulties. And we had social workers from NGOs or from the public sector who were not able as well to identify legal issues concerning these problems people had. And it became more and more complex, and it's here for lawyers to explain the position of NGOs, because we have more and more rights, but specific rights for specific groups, so we have more and more legal issues to know who is within the scope of each right. For example, right to work for European workers, but if they come from countries in a transitory period of time, we don't know exactly. And the right of the children, social care, when you are asylum seekers or not really asylum seekers, but not far, social workers can't understand now all the rights linked to all these situations. And we had lawyers, avvocati, who are able to go in courts to defend people, but who don't know these people, who don't identify if their rights are violated. And they don't have time, these lawyers, because they have many cases to defend, and they waste a lot of time waiting their turn in courts. And they have a problem because we have this national law who were supposed to protect people in our welfare states models, and we have this useless EU and international soft law, which is the tool of the neoliberal monster. But during the recent years, things changed because our national legal framework is less and less protective for people, and we live under these austerity paradigms. And you have to balance in Italy between Goldman Sachs or Mediaset as government. So we have less and less protection from the national level, and we have more and more protection from the international level. As Jamie and Porrick explained, we have more and more protection, but we are unable to understand, especially us coming from Latin countries with our Roman law culture, we don't understand anything about this Article 1, Protocol 1, for example, issue, and property as a substantial interest on a possession. For us, this is Chinese in legal terms. How someone living in a squat or in a piece of land can be protected by a right of property. Sorry for the translators, but property, possessions, it doesn't match in our Latin languages. So for lawyers, it's very complex to go in courts and to use this jurisprudence coming from international and EU law. So we need also academics and students to use researchers and to make students work and to dig these international inputs we might have. So in France, we try to put everybody together in local groups, in national groups, to make training sessions for the social sector, to use academics for the lawyers when they have issues, to identify crossroads between different human rights or social rights approaches, migrant rights, social protection law, housing law, housing rights, employment and housing, employment and migrants, and to produce information, to follow the recent case laws, to make links between the international case laws and the local ones. We try to also bring food to academics through new cases, through the social issues identified by social workers. We try to inform also public services and politicians and all the technostructure to say, okay, you have to be more prepared to the EU evolutions and to the international evolutions. It's not against you, the system, we are doing that. It's also to help you to be more updated and more coherent with the international framework. So, okay, we have many meetings, books, case laws at the local, national level, and I will just insist on small aspects. We also have to feed this international level, and we can feed the international structure from a very local level, and this is a direct message to Genova. We had this collective complaint procedure against France in 2007. So a collective complaint procedure in the Council of Europe, it's a sort of very soft law decision, not very useful apparently, but it produces international norms. You say, okay, isn't it a violation of international housing rights to wait 2 or 3 years average period of time to be able to attend a social housing? Are these emergency shelters providing services with sufficient quality? I don't know. Is the definition of overcrowded housing sufficient? Are travelers well treated in France? And we had sort of 100 range of questions that we had answers, and these answers are providing international standards, and these standards are elsewhere used by international courts and then local courts, and they bind international tools and then also national public tools. So, for example, our opponents in this specific case from the housing ministry in France were very interested to lose the case. If they lose the case, they can say, we don't match with the international standards. Ministry of Budget, you have to give us more money. We are legally binded, so we are quite allied in a trial, apparently against French state. And we can do a lot, and more, to a more binding court, which is the European Court of Justice, now through this preliminary procedure. I don't know the English word. It's question préjudicielle in French. It must be closer to Italian. And now the local judges can ask European Court of Justice to make decisions. So we as NGOs, lawyers on a very local level, we can create European jurisprudence through our local courts that binds the Commission, that binds the countries, so we can produce more and more social justice, and we can make EU more and more a tool for social justice as the countries are less and less through our local litigations. So we are here in Genova, and we are a little bit like Andrea Doria. We are the pirates who can become prince now. So we would be very guilty if we don't do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc, merci beaucoup. Grazie. Allora, la proposta adesso è quindi quella di prenderci un break fino a mezzogiorno, poi rientrare e con interventi vostri e domande specifiche dirette anche alla loro esperienza fino alla 1, che è l'1:15 l'orario di conclusione che ci eravamo dati, cercare di capire effettivamente se davanti abbiamo la possibilità, anche partendo da Genova, di sviluppare qualcosa in questa direzione. Grazie, il bar è qui al piano, ribadisco, al banco della federazione potete trovare i materiali in francese, non sbaglio più questa volta a ritirarli, alcuni altri materiali in italiano, iscriversi alla newsletter della federazione che permette di avere aggiornamenti costanti su questi temi. A fra poco.